Good morning, everyone. It is July 12th, and I'm going to give a roundup of what happened at the NATO Summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. This one's going to be focused on Ukraine. I might do a second video that focuses on China. But the summit really started with regard to Ukraine with a fiery tweet from President Zelensky, where he spoke about how he was on his way to Vilnius and they received signals that wording was being changed and discussed without Ukraine's input. And this was something that he took as an affront because he said that if there are changes to how NATO views the entrance of a country such as Ukraine, that Ukraine should have some say in it. He said that it's unprecedented and absurd when the time frame is not set for invitation or membership. For Russia, this means motivation to continue its terror. Uncertainty is weakness, and I will openly discuss this at the summit, is what Zelensky said. Now, President Biden has made it clear that he believes Ukraine should be admitted to NATO, but not while it is at war. Other leaders have stated the same thing. There is a strong argument for this perspective. If Ukraine were admitted now, it would effectively mean that NATO's member countries would be at war with Russia. However, President Zelensky, and I've said this before as well, is correct in pointing out that by making it clear that Ukraine's membership can only happen once the war is over, it gives Russia motivation to prolong the war as much as possible. Now, around the same time Zelensky was making his fiery tweets, France announced that it was sending 50 Scout missiles. In fact, some of them are already on their way to Ukraine. These missiles are essentially the same as UK Storm Shadow missiles, so they will provide some additional capability and help Ukraine. In later meetings, security guarantees from leading nations and assurances that Ukraine's future lies in NATO appeared to calm down President Zelensky, as well as some of the other more fiery leaders that are adamant about having Ukraine join, especially those that border Russia, see Ukraine joining NATO as an additional line of defense. It calmed a lot of these worries and frustrations because there's some pretty significant things that took place with regards to the different conferences that happened with Ukraine in mind. Now, among the moves NATO took was agreeing to remove one of the requirements for Ukrainians' entrance into NATO. And it was the membership action plan. This is something that all the countries have to do to show that they're worthy essentially of joining NATO. Now, this process was eliminated for Ukraine due to the previous close relationship Ukraine has had with NATO countries. A lot of them train in Germany. Since 2014, many Ukrainian units go to Germany to train with the United States at Grafenwehr, at Hohenfels, as well as have integrated into some of the NATO infrastructure across the entire gamut of countries. Now, what eliminating the membership action plan means is that Ukraine has shown it is worthy of joining the alliance, but due to the ongoing war, it cannot. And unfortunately, this means a firm timeline for Ukraine's official membership is not available either. But the map is often the biggest hurdle to get over, so that is good news for Ukraine. In addition, there has been some security guarantees that were made during the two-day meetings that absolutely help Ukraine. For instance, President Zelensky agreed with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to commence F-16 fighter pilot training in August of this year in Romania, with 10 other nations providing trainers on the Dutch F-16s for the Ukrainians. They have also agreed on the specific contributions of the Netherlands to strengthen Ukraine's air defenses and its artillery. The hope for Ukraine is that these F-16s, with their delivery from various countries and the pilots being trained, will have them in the skies over Ukraine in spring of 2024. Also, an agreement between Ukraine and Germany was signed for additional Patriot launchers and missiles. Ukraine and Sweden signed an agreement on the cooperation of secret information sharing and defense procurement, largely because now Sweden will be joining NATO as well. Great Britain announced that it will be providing £50 million, or about $65 million in military aid to Ukraine. This funding package includes more ammunition for its Challenger 2 tanks and 70 combat logistics vehicles, including some combat tracked reconnaissance vehicles that are good in offensive operations because they're a little faster while still maintaining defense. The UK will also provide funding for a rehabilitation center for Ukrainian servicemen injured in combat. Additionally, Australia said they will transfer 30 Bushmaster armored personnel carriers to Ukraine, and Norway will provide Ukraine with an additional 1,000 small Black Hornet reconnaissance drones. President Biden and G7 leaders unveiled a substantial show of support for Ukraine, though. This is a pretty big one. They offered a joint declaration of support aimed at bolstering Ukraine's military capability. And it's shown to acknowledge that Ukraine is not able to be invited as a member of NATO, but creates a platform that does not hinder efforts of G7 countries to boost each other's security as well as Ukraine's. So often what happens is when you have countries that make certain weapons, they have requirements on those weapons, such as you can't transfer them to other countries, etc. This essentially lifts that so that there is an ability for each G7 nation to negotiate long-term bilateral security commitments with Ukraine. So Biden pledged to help Ukraine build strong defenses across the land, air, and sea spaces, emphasizing the importance of stability and deterrence against any threats in the region. Clearly, the only threat is Russia at this point. The negotiations that took place in this declaration focus on three main goals. The first goal is to ensure a sustainable force capable of defending Ukraine, deterring Russian aggression, and that's achieved through continuing to provision security assistance, providing modern military equipment, giving support to their military industrial base development, training their forces, sharing intelligence, and support for like cyber defense initiatives, etc. The second goal is to strengthen Ukraine's long-term economic stability and resilience, including the post-war reconstruction and recovery efforts, as well as to create conditions conducive to promoting economic prosperity, as well as securing energy, specifically aimed at its not just securing energy in making sure that people have the lights turned on and heat in their homes, but also securing the nuclear power plants. And then the third and final goal is to provide technical and financial support in the near term that immediately repairs and builds upon the resilience of Ukrainian infrastructure that is damaged or destroyed by Russia, essentially. And what this does is it creates a platform for implementing reforms so that Ukraine can further ascend in the Euro-Atlantic, the various Euro-Atlantic alliances, including NATO, the European Union, etc. Now, Zelensky thanked the leaders profusely for the new commitments and stated that it brings significant security opportunities to Ukraine. He expressed his appreciation to everyone involved in making it possible, calling the declaration a powerful statement of support for Ukraine. Now, while this was going on, Russia began conducting drone strikes on the Ukrainian port of Odessa and the infrastructure specifically aimed at the grain silos, possibly as an attempt to discourage NATO members from providing more military aid to Ukraine. But as with these things, usually just pisses off the NATO members and they end up sending more aid. The reason they're attacking grain silos is to making a symbolic act of defiance against the grain deal that NATO has always been trying to keep running so that the world has access, and specifically nations in the Middle East, nations in Africa have access to Ukrainian grain, which is critical to feeding them. Meanwhile, Russia is just content to starve anyone out so long as they get what they want. Additionally, during the first day of the summit, Xi Jinping coincidentally announced that he expects Putin to visit China in October. It was just a joint effort to try to undermine what was going on in Vilnius. What was fascinating is there's been some reports around the city of Vilnius and shown what was going on with some of the people that are citizens of Lithuania, where they had posters declaring stronger together. 89% of Lithuania's residents support the country's NATO membership. So there's a lot of pro-NATO sentiment within Lithuania. Many older Lithuanians shared their memories to reporters of the grim days under Soviet rule. Some recalled standing in lines with their mothers, hoping for food that often wasn't available. Another mentioned that the KGB building in the center of Vilnius served as both a Nazi headquarters and a KGB headquarters where Lithuanians were killed and tortured, with a lot of the prevailing sentiment around the country being never again will they allow someone to do that to them. And the umbrella or security blanket of NATO gives them that opportunity to once again be free and secure again. So that is from the Ukrainian standpoint of what's going to happen in the NATO summit. It looks like Ukraine, while not getting membership, got about as much as it could. Biden and Zelensky reportedly talked about ATACMS missiles, but there's no word on what the agreements there were. I know quietly within the Pentagon and the White House there have been discussions about potentially providing them, but there's some other reasons why the United States might hold back, and it doesn't have to deal with being afraid of Russia. And I can make a video separate on that as well. But overall, it seemed to be pretty positive for Ukraine, and they'll walk away with more security guarantees, more assistance packages, and a long-term path to potentially joining NATO as fast